Well, the 2018 U.S. midterm elections were most Americans' first opportunity to pass judgment on Donald Trump since he was elected 2 years ago. The U.S. holds congressional elections every 2 years. At each election, the whole of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the 100-member Senate are elected. The representatives thus serve a 2-year term and the senators have a 6-year term. These elections are known as midterms when they fall outside of the 4-year presidential election cycle. Now, being in the middle of the presidential term, they are usually understood to be at least partially a reaction to the president's performance thus far, which means 21 months since Donald Trump has been in office, and usually see the president's party losing seats. Donald Trump's Republicans went into the election campaign controlling both houses of the Congress. The opposition Democrats in blue, they were in fact hoping for a wave that would put them in a position to moderate and sometimes block Donald Trump's agenda. Now, here's what happened in these midterms. Take a look. Interesting. Democrats, they ended up winning the House of Representatives, which was with the Republicans so far. Republicans, though, retain majority when it comes to the Senate. That's the first point. Now, when it comes to the House of Representatives, Democrats have won that, as we just told you, and they can now decide on which bills can come into the House. That's the takeaway from their win. In the Senate, Republicans have retained the majority, and Donald Trump can continue to make judicial appointments, and he can also replace cabinet members. That's the power with him. When it comes to the result after the election, it remains with him. Now, as far as the impact of these elections is concerned, Democrats can investigate these following things. For instance, the Russian collusion in the last presidential election, Trump's business dealings, sexual assault allegations, and also go ahead with the impeachment proceedings. That's very, very important. Joining me here in the studio is Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, Dr. Sriram Sundar Chaulia, Professor and Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Thank you both for joining me on the show. Let me start by asking you, Pramit, what's the main takeaway? We understand that it's a split verdict when it comes to this midterm poll, but net-net, it was seen as a referendum on Donald Trump, and that seemed to have not really worked for the Democrats, if you look at it that way.
Well, the question is really having such a degree of polarization in the United States right now. The issue is whether you could bring out your base in terms of vote. What was interesting in this midterm, one was the turnout was enormous. The turnout was almost 30% more than the last midterm election,
right,
which meant that both bases had come out. Nonetheless, the Democrats were still able to get a roughly 7% swing in their favor in the overall popular vote, which, if it was translated to a presidential election, would be an almost easy victory for them,
right,
or likely victory in the next presidential election. That's one area. So on the vote side, even in the Senate, where they lost seats, the popular vote was 12 million votes in favor of the Democrats over the Republicans. Because the Senate, most of the seats being defended, as you mentioned, or the Senate, only 1/3 of the seats actually came up for re-election. Most of the seats being defended were Democrat seats rather than Republican. But that means if they can maintain this momentum when the next election comes, which will be coterminous with the presidential one, they have a very good chance of taking back the Senate, because then a lot of Republican seats will be up for grabs.
Right.
The second point is, and this is the important thing, once you get one of the houses, you are able to launch, you control the congressional committees in that house. So you are now, and you can see, I think Politico had a list of 15 potential investigations that the Democrats are now planning to launch using the House of Representatives' investigative powers against the Trump administration. And the idea will be that over the next 1 year, they will completely paralyze the Trump administration with investigations on everything from Trump's taxes to Russian collusion to anything they could find. And whatever we can see about the Trump administration, there's plenty there. The Trump administration has been accused of all sorts of things, and they don't seem to be very good at following their own regulations. So we'll see a lot of internal bickering and fighting and investigations all through the next year, and I think that will be the primary takeaway for the Democrats.
Right. Dr. Chaulia, for sure there are reasons for Democrats to cheer at this point, but, the expectations were far more when it came to giving a blow to Donald Trump. That hasn't really come across in these midterm. What is your reading of the final result?
Yeah, Sana, I think the thing is the polarization is clear in geographical terms, in racial terms. There's a saying in America that the Democrats own the coasts and the Republicans have the real estate, and which means essentially the less populated Midlands and the rural and semi-urban places where Trump and his followers in the Republican Party managed to retain control, but they lost the heavily populated coastal areas, and that confirms the larger division of the society between the so-called nativists or nationalists slash racists or xenophobes on one hand, and the more cosmopolitan, multicultural, liberal, and globalists on the other hand. So I think I think the economy has been doing relatively well, and that's one of the reasons the Democrats could not make a massive dent as was expected. But nonetheless, now you have the situation of the divided government, as it's called, with one of the chambers, and if, as Pramit is saying, it's possible that even the other chamber may flip in 2 years' time, then you have a situation which goes back to the fundamental, constitutional paralysis of the U.S. governance system that's been there right since Obama came to power in 2009. So the same cycle could be repeated, where you will have, possible shutdowns of government and refusal of the legislators to go along with the presidential budgets, and a reduction of American policy making to a series of executive orders without lacking legislative basis. And on the ground in the society, as we know, recently there was this white supremacist who went out and killed Jewish people in front of a synagogue. There is this whole, social friction that's emerging, and I expect that this will get worse. There's a lot of these far-right groups who will now say that, our mission is to stop this blue wave from ever emerging, and they may go to any extent for that. With the already you saw the
so the results like will give those groups impetus, you're saying. Pramit, you mentioned the high voter turnout. In fact, it's being seen a closer figure, if you look at the voter turnout, to the last presidential election, not the one in which Donald Trump was elected. But the numbers are huge. But what does that mean?
Well, it means that your ability to mobilize your base, in other words, both sides feel very strongly about their position, and Trump, whatever else about him, is definitely polarizing in the sense that everybody is either anti or pro-Trump, and there are very few Americans who now have a neutral position about their president. And that's what you're seeing. So presidential elections always have a high turnout, but midterms tend to have a low one, and this midterm compared to the previous midterm is much higher. So yes, the turnout was heavy, and I think geographically what was interesting is that while the South, the American South, has always been a Republican stronghold, and therefore you fully expected them to do well there. Though it's interesting that in Georgia and Florida, where they're going for a recount, you're not only seeing the Democrats being very close to victory, I mean, whatever else, it was almost a 50-50 vote. They ran that despite having two black candidates.
Right.
They still came close to winning the governorships and senatorships of two big southern states. But the Midwest, a large portion of the Midwest, especially the Midwest, the upper Midwest areas, Minnesota, Kansas, for example, very conservative state, have gone completely Democrat. So we've seen a lot of the gains for the Democrats have been in Midwest, and this was the swing area.
Right.
The Democrats knew they could count on the Pacific Coast, the Northeast, to vote in their direction, and the South would always go Republican. Trump's accomplishment was to wrest the Midwest, the so-called blue wall, from the Democratic Party under Hillary Clinton. So states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, all of them defected, if you wish.